Good afternoon, ladies and gents, colleagues, friends. I see there's a lot of familiar names and very soon faces. You're welcome to switch on your camera if you speak, unmute yourself and ask a question. I see there's still a few people joining, so we must maybe wait another minute until it's 3 o'clock, and then we can get going with this afternoon session. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I almost want to say family. There's a few names that we saw earlier the week, people that participated, so welcome back. For those people that join us the first time here this afternoon, it's a privilege having you in our midst. This is, I think, one of the highlights for SABSA, the South African Business School Association. We've been talking about this network session or panel discussions for a while now, and eventually when we put a day down and we decide when to go, everybody got involved. So all 22 member schools participated and support this. Only a few are presenting, and we started on Tuesday and we'll wrap it up tomorrow. So it's really, I think, a good initiative, and for that we want to thank you, the chair of SABSA, Professor Jonas Randall, the general manager we have here today, Ms. Ann Wilson. Thank you very much for that, and then all to the members. We're all colleagues in this. We want to make a difference. And last, not most important, for all of you that are attending the sessions, it's not a one-way discussion. It must be interactive. So at any point in time, if you have questions, please put that in the chat box. I will monitor that and I'll facilitate questions. And if necessary, we will post it there and the facilitators will ask us. The sessions, we run sharply to the hour, not to fall behind. So we will finish at 6 o'clock this evening. And we have 3 sessions this afternoon. The very first one about research paradigms and supervision, and then we have a session on what is a PhD contribution, and then the last one that will start at 5:05, doing a comprehensive literature review in a PhD study. So today's all the PhD program, and Tuesday and Wednesday, yesterday we had the master's program, and tomorrow we bring them all together and we will continue that discussion. The session here is not just for academics, it's specifically for supervisors and examiners, and not just new supervisors and examiners, but also seasoned supervisors and examiners. Hence, you know, it's an open discussion and a friendly environment amongst colleagues to talk about matters of concern and where we have challenges. And the first speaker this afternoon, it's a privilege for me to welcome him. He's also a colleague of mine, Dr. Franzél du Plooy-Cilliers, currently the Academic Executive Dean in Academic at the Da Vinci Institute. Prior to this, Franzél worked at the Independent Institute of Education. She was former to that, being the Executive Dean of Research. She was also head of faculty. Previous life, head of the school. Many experience you can saw from her CV. She got a commendation award for teaching excellence from Monash University in Australia. Franzél published in many journals in the past. Definitely important, I think, the award she got from Monash University were for outstanding female academics, and it's also then a privilege to welcome Franzél here as our first female presenter this afternoon. Franzél, it's a privilege to having you here. Besides being a publisher in academic articles, Franzél also presented a number of research papers at national and international conferences. She's the editor of books, including Research Methodology, and you can see the book there on the screen, Research That Matter. So hence, I cannot think about a more appropriate person to talk to about research paradigms this afternoon than Franzél, because she specialized in the methodology, and you will hear when she starts to speak, really an authority on this matter. Subject expertise in organizational and business communication, interpersonal communication, besides research methodology. She's also a regular supervisor to master's and doctoral students, and similarly also examine and still examine many doctoral theses and dissertations at this moment in time. And then, like all of us, you also do duty, and she's a regular reviewer for the Council of Higher Education on programs and panel reviews for site visits. So without further ado, I would love to then to hand over to Franzél and ask us to take us through the research paradigms in supervision. And as a contextualization, yesterday we spoke quite a bit on which paradigm is the best, and we try and mix it up, and we refer to this session today. Hence, we will continue with it. And looking at the time now, we will have all the way up till 4 o'clock, including the questions and answers. And at that point, I will wrap it up and we'll move into the next section at 4:05. Franzél, over to you. Thank you very much for being here. We know it's a difficult week due to many reasons, but we appreciate your presence here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Harvey, and welcome everyone. And thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be sharing a little bit of time with you on something that I actually feel quite passionate about, namely research paradigms. And I often feel that they don't always get the attention that they deserve, especially when it comes to PhD studies. So I'm hoping that I can share a little bit with you around research paradigms. I'm hoping that you will find this useful. Unfortunately, cannot go into the depth that I would have liked to, but you can always contact me if you need more information. And we can also look into, can you guys still hear me? It looked like somebody wanted to mute me.
Yes, we can hear you, but somebody did mute you, Franzél.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. All right, so talking about something that's really something that I feel passionate about, so research paradigms. Sorry, Rian, I'm not able to move the slide. I don't know if it's just slow. Rian?
Okay, yeah, I can hear you. If you
just
go click on next.
Good. All right, so again, welcome to the Home of Remarkability. So it's a privilege for us at Da Vinci to be hosting this event and to have all our colleagues and peers join us here today in this virtual space. So thank you for joining us. And in today's session, we will be looking at a couple of things. The first one is the significance of paradigms in research. We will be looking at key aspects of research paradigms that should be addressed. Paradigms as a means to organize information, justify choices, and locate research. And for me, in particular, this is one of the key benefits of making use of paradigms, is that it just makes your methodological choices so much easier when it comes to justifying why you did what you did or decided to do what you did. And then obviously the methodological implications of paradigms as well. So which methodologies goes with which paradigm and how very briefly does that then work. But before we go into the presentation, Rian has divided you into different breakout rooms. I think they might be quite big because of the numbers. But what I would like you to do is to very briefly, I'm going to just give you about 5 minutes to do so, among yourselves to discuss 3 things. And if you don't get to the last one, that's not the end of the world. But I really would like you to talk about the first 2 and maybe to spend more time on the second question as opposed to the first and third. So the first question then is, in your opinion or in your experience, what is the importance of incorporating a research paradigm into a doctoral study? So is it something that is important to do or not? And then if so, why or why not? The second one, in your experience, what are the aspects that students struggle with the most when it comes to research paradigms? And then finally, PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy. So what does philosophy mean and why is it significant in a doctorate? So Rian, we will start the clock. So if you can assign people, you've been assigned to a particular group. So please discuss. You are also welcome, if you didn't get to say what you wanted to say, you are welcome to post your opinions in the chat. And when we give feedback, I would like a couple of you to maybe just provide us with some brief feedback after the session or after your 5-minute discussion. to not repeat what others have said. So please just add additional or new insight. And again, like I said, you are welcome to post in the chat if you did not get an opportunity to voice your opinion. So we'll give you 5 minutes. Please discuss those 3 questions. Are they important or not? What are the issues that the students struggle with? And why the philosophy in PhD? Right, so Rian, can we bring people back into the room again, please?
Right, I'll close all the rooms. Takes about a minute.
Good. Right, so I can see a hand. Is everybody back in the room?
No, can I want to go back. I don't know what happened. I think it's my phone. There was a
No,
call.
We closed the discussion room. So all the rooms have been closed. So it wasn't on, it's not your fault. It's not on your side.
Oh, okay. Because
All
someone
right,
was
so was someone still talking and then they got rudely interrupted?
Sure, that was quick. That was one of the quickest ones in a long time.
Keep it snappy.
That was a quickie.
There's like a speed paradigming.
Speed dating.
Yeah, speed dating
Right.
for paradigms.
Okay, so can we maybe just hear from a couple of people from the floor? Maybe just in the first one, what was the general consensus? Is it important or is it not important? Any of the participants who would like to share what they feel the general consensus was?
Franzél, from our side, we reflected on the third red question, and Teresa took the lead on that one. So were we not at liberty to speak about the first two,
Okay,
although we have opinions around that, but maybe we should.
all
allow
right.
the
So any
audience to see.
opinions anyone would like to share in terms of whether it's important or not? Because I think that's a very important place to start. Because I've heard lots of people saying that they don't really see the point and they can't really see why students have to talk about paradigms, especially within a business school context. So I would like to hear what the general consensus was.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
question or
I
comment
can.
from. Yeah, sorry.
I can give my opinion. Our group didn't get to it yet. The time was a bit limited, but from my
Sure.
perspective, I would say it is important because it's a manifestation of your epistemology and your ontology. You know, that is kind of the brand of what you are going to do in your research methodology.
Fantastic. Okay, I really like that because without your knowing what your epistemological or ontological position is, it's very difficult to talk about how you're going to make any contribution in terms of your study. And that's exactly what we would like to do with a PhD.
Yes.
Any other
Prof.
opinions around this?
Clayton Williams, Clayton, and then Patrick thereafter, but Clayton, you first.
Yeah, I think it's not just important, it's critical because the paradigm will dictate how you interpret the problem. It will, you know, it seems silly to say it's going to, you know, dictate the methodology because that's coming later. But I mean, the paradigm will dictate how we investigate that problem. The terminology we use, it will it will help us to understand, you know, what meaning we assign to words like rational. So, you know, are we using an economist's paradigm? Are we using a philosopher's paradigm when we use the word rational? And what do we mean by that word? And it will influence and dictate almost the way we interpret the findings. So it's absolutely crucial because it will also, through driving those, it will also create a number of limitations in terms of things that we miss when we're looking at the problem, assumptions that we will make, you know, generally accepted theories that are accepted within a paradigm, etc., etc.
Absolutely love it and fully agree with you. And I think you have really captured the essence of why it is important very well there. So thank you very much for that. Patrick, maybe a last one from you.
Thanks. I think the paradigm sort of like defines and grounds you as a researcher from your ontological and epistemological perspective. And I think it's important because your PhD effectively is a personal reflection of your philosophy, and that philosophy is grounded really in how you look at the world and how you understand the nature of knowledge.
Thank you very much for that, and couldn't agree more. All right, so I'm delighted to know that that I'm preaching to the converted. So that's a good thing, so that I don't have to convince you that it is actually important and that it does have a place, especially in PhD studies. So for those of you who disagree, you're also welcome to obviously type in the chat if there's anything else you would like to add. So I just don't want to pause too long on this because I'm actually quite interested in your experience around what the particular aspects are that students struggle with when it comes to research paradigms. I would love for you to share some ideas. Those of you who got to discuss this in terms of, or just speak from your own experience in terms of what students are struggling with.
Hello? Yes.
Yes,
I've noticed that students struggle with paradigms because of probably lack of appreciation of the importance of paradigms in a dissertation or in research. Yet paradigms are very important from the beginning that a student sits down to talk about the background to the study, the research problem. Because a student comes up with the research objectives, research questions, hypotheses. But when you ask the student what the research paradigm is, he will tell you that, no, I've not thought about it. Then how did you come up with quantitative research questions without knowledge of the paradigm that you are going to use, or qualitative research questions or research objectives without the knowledge of the paradigm that you are going to use? So it's very important that from the way to go dissertation or thesis students understand what a paradigm is. But most of them struggle with identifying their research paradigms when they are carrying out research or dissertations. So I think this discussion is going to be very critical to most of us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Sibangani, I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly. I see your hand.
Just unmute yourself, Sibangani.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think for me, where the students struggle a lot with issues of paradigms is the location of the paradigms in the research structure. And so that location in the research structure, because we know there is the introductory part, the literature review, the methodology, and so on and so on. But that location of the paradigms is where it is a bit more problematic to say how then do they link the paradigm to the introduction, to the literature, and also to the research methodology, and eventually the findings and so on. That's what I've experienced. Thank you.
Right, so thank you for that. As I said, please feel free to share in the chat, just a bit mindful of time. So, and I'm going to come back to the last question. But what I also find from my own experience is that students are very intimidated by paradigms. So just even the word paradigm already intimidates them. And then you start talking about things like epistemology and ontology and axiology and all these ologies that make people really confused and really intimidates them, because it's not something that we use in our day-to-day conversations. The other issue is that students like to read about their topic because they're fascinated by their topic and they enjoy reading about the literature, things that has been written around their topic. But students don't really like reading about paradigms, and they don't really like reading about methodology. So this is the part that I found with my students is something that is really lacking. It's not something that they enjoy doing. Often when they read articles as well, they will read the literature review and then they will skip the methodology part. So I always try to encourage my students to also read the methodology part, because we have to become more well-versed in methodology in order to become good at this. So just a couple of did you knows then. So did you know that all research is actually built on certain underlying philosophical assumptions about what constitutes valid and trustworthy research and the research method appropriate for the development of knowledge? So you cannot get away from philosophy. It's impossible to have a philosophical position or to have certain philosophical assumptions. So whether you are consciously aware of them or not, actually not really the point, but when we do research, it is always based on certain underlying assumptions about what constitutes valid knowledge, what is trustworthy, what is not, what counts as knowledge, what does not count as knowledge, and especially scientific knowledge. The second one is that Thomas Kuhn was the first person to use the word paradigm to mean, and you see again the word philosophical, a philosophical way of thinking. So the word philosophy popping up a lot when we talk about things like paradigms. And as I said, when you look at the PhD, it stands for a Doctor of Philosophy. So the word philosophy is very prominent in PhDs as well. So we cannot get away from the philosophical assumptions that form part of doctoral studies and most research for that matter. Then something that I found very interesting, I once came across a study where it was actually conducted at UJ, where they looked at the examiner reports of students across a couple of faculties. And what they found was that where students were able to effectively incorporate the paradigms and paradigmatic positions, they were actually able to produce more insightful knowledge than students who were not able to do so. And that these students were also more likely to pass and also less likely to have their dissertations returned to them or their theses returned to them for them to make additional improvements. So it's just interesting to know that paradigms really do contribute, and getting that insight, getting that philosophical understanding of what it is that people are doing really does add value and contribute to their studies. So then just very briefly, and this is important, I'm going to come back to this just now, the word paradigm means pattern, worldview, or tradition. And specifically for our discussion today, I want you to keep in mind that it is a worldview or a tradition, because that becomes very important when we talk about the different paradigms and what they do and how we're supposed to approach them. And then just very briefly, the word philosophy then means love of wisdom. So I don't know how many of you knew that, but that is what philosophy means. It's just basically the love of wisdom. So the love of learning, producing knowledge, enhancing what we're doing through the production of knowledge. All right, so moving on then, one of the, an ex-colleague of mine sent me an article the other day, and it was actually about qualitative research. And part of the title was Sticking Feathers Together in the Hope of Producing a Duck. And I thought this was very appropriate, and especially appropriate for paradigms as well. Because when students do their research, especially if they are not very experienced, this is often what they're trying to do. So they grab a couple of feathers, they stick them together, and then they hope that they are going to produce a duck. And this is where our paradigms become quite useful, because if we follow the, and I don't want to use the word rules because they're not rules, but if we follow the tradition, if we stick to the tradition, then our chances of putting together a duck is much better than just randomly putting things together and not really knowing where we're going with this or why it's important. So what you see in front of you is, in our part of the world, traditionally associated with what exactly? What are you seeing in front of you? If you had to give it a name, what would you give it? You can just shout out.
Wimpy breakfast.
Breakfast. All right. So in our part of the world, this is normally seen as breakfast. So you see there's cereal and bacon and eggs and pancakes and all kinds of nice things that we normally in our part of the world associate with breakfast.
High GI.
And normally, high tea. Okay.
No, high GI.
Oh, high GI. Sorry, I thought you said high tea. I want to say, okay. All right. And normally when we serve breakfast, we serve it with juice or coffee. So if you were to have breakfast and somebody served it with beer, would you be surprised? Would that surprise you if you went to sit down
Yes,
for a breakfast?
absolutely.
Yes.
Yep. And they serve beer instead of orange juice or coffee. That would surprise you. You may not be disappointed, but it will definitely surprise you.
Not if I'm in
So,
Germany.
sorry?
Not if I'm in Germany.
Not if you're in Germany. Maybe not if you're in Germany. Absolutely. But that's an important point. Because if you're in Germany, there is a likelihood that you will get served beer with your breakfast. On the other hand, if somebody invited you for dinner, they said, come and have a nice dinner with us tonight, and they served this to you, would you be surprised?
Sure. Yes.
Absolutely. You are going to be surprised. That is not something you're going to expect to see for dinner, because the tradition is that we serve this for breakfast. However, is there a rule that says that you can only serve this for breakfast, or that you cannot serve beer with breakfast?
No.
No. No rule. There is no rule that says that you are not allowed to have this for dinner, and there is no rule that says you're not allowed to have beer with your breakfast. These are traditions, so it's norms. We see this as normal, and we conform to the norm. And what I want you to understand about paradigms is they're exactly like this. They are traditions. So there's no rule that says you must do things in that particular way. You can deviate from the norm. However, when you do, and this is what I always tell to my students, if you follow the norm, if you follow the tradition, then nobody's going to question anything, because people are familiar with the tradition and it's not going to confuse them. But the minute that you deviate from the tradition, that is then when you have to start explaining yourself. So if you are going to serve beer with breakfast, then you need to tell people why. So if you are saying that you are doing an interpretive study, but you're going to make use of quantitative research, then you are confusing people. Then you have to explain to them why. No rule that says you're not allowed to do it, but you are confusing your reader because you are deviating from the norm. You are deviating from the tradition. And that's an important thing to just maybe understand about research paradigms, is that they're not supposed to be prescriptive, and students can deviate from them, and it's okay if they do, but then they have to justify it. They have to explain why, and they have to demonstrate to their reader that they know that they are deviating from the norm, and that they know that they are deviating from the tradition. Another point that I wanted to make around paradigms is it's similar to the story of the blind men and the elephant. So there's the story about the 6 blind men, and all of them were feeling an elephant, and each one of them felt a different part of the elephant. And the one obviously said it's a spear, and another said it's a snake, another said it's a fan or a wall or a trunk or a rope. So each one of them was looking at one aspect of reality, of one aspect of a phenomenon called an elephant. None of them are wrong, but none of them are right either. So the fact of the matter is they are looking at different parts of the same phenomenon. And this is what makes research paradigms so interesting. There is no research paradigm that is superior to another. They do different things. They look at reality from different perspectives. And that's what we want. And that's why we don't want to say positivism is better than interpretivism, or better than critical realism, or pragmatism, or whatever the case may be, because it all depends on the purpose of the study. So the paradigm needs to suit the purpose of the study. And as I said, none of them are superior to the others. It just depends on what it is that you are trying to achieve through your research. So even though it's a very bizarre looking elephant, at least when we put all the insights together from the different paradigms, from the different ways of doing things, we actually get a more accurate picture of a phenomenon or of reality. So when people have debates about whether one paradigm is more important than another, or whether one paradigm is superior to another, and there's also things like paradigm shifts where people would say that one paradigm replaced another. No, they haven't replaced the others. They are still there. And they are also emerging paradigms. They are new paradigms that are emerging. So paradigms there are no superior paradigms. There is no, this one is better than the next one. But there could be a paradigm that is better suited for a particular research problem than another one. And that will depend, as I said, on the research problem and whether the students are actually able to locate their research problem within a particular paradigm that will provide them with the best insight to solve that particular research problem. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions, comments?
Franzél, there's quite a busy discussion going on in the chat box. I think one of the things earlier on, there was a remark and say it's not students that's just confused, also some of the supervisors, and then there was some sources being shared, but I don't see any specific question at the moment for you.
Thank you, Obia.
Comments.
And I agree. I have also seen that supervisors are sometimes equally confused about paradigms. And another thing, and it's interesting for me to listen to some of the presentations as well, because I can very quickly see what a particular person's preference is. So it's very easy to see what a supervisor's preference is, or specifically with supervisors, not so much with students, because they have not really figured this out for themselves yet.
Yeah.
But
There's a hand by Clayton, though maybe Clayton has a question for us.
all right, yes.
So I'm going to make a statement, but the question comes in asking your sort of opinion / rebuttal to the statement. And from my perspective, paradigms are that critical that they shouldn't be left for the PhD level, but that even with a master's or an MBA, you know, stating the paradigm, it doesn't add more work to the thesis. It doesn't make the thesis longer, or the dissertation rather. But it definitely gives that, you know, clarity about how are we looking at this problem, how are we interpreting the data, what do we expect to see based on our paradigm. Your thoughts?
Clayton, if I could have my way, I would introduce it at undergrad level already, because I think the longer students grapple with it, the more we expose them to it, the more they learn about it, read about it, the more familiar it becomes, and the more they internalize it, and the better judgments they can make by the time they get to PhD level. So I fully agree with you. I think it's way too late to introduce it at PhD level. I would much have preferred that we started at undergraduate level already.
No, excellent. I've got my 13-year-old son here next to me, busy reading, and I'm already trying to explain to them what paradigms are. So
excellent, excellent, father. Well done. Sorry, Sylvester, yes?
Okay, Prof, thank you very much. Please, I don't know if my question is coming ahead of time, but I want to know if you are writing a PhD by publication, how do you incorporate your research paradigm into the papers? Because I realize if you look into the literature, there are a lot of papers published out there without saying anything about paradigms. So I want to know, is it really necessary to state them if you are doing it by publication, or you can still be silent about it?
So basically, you can always be silent about your paradigm, and I think that's part of the problem, because what people are saying is the minute that you are silent about your paradigm, then it lacks the depth, it lacks the justification. You make your own life easier if you select a paradigm. If you say that I'm working, say, for example, from an interpretivist paradigm, so the purpose of my study is to gain an in-depth understanding of a particular phenomenon, and that's why I'm using qualitative research. So it just makes everything easier. It just makes justifying your choices so much easier when you actually understand your paradigm. So even for academic articles, there's not a lot of space, so people often neglect talking about their paradigms when they write their articles. But it's always good to talk about your paradigm, because it also brings your reader into your world to understand what perspective you are working from. And as external examiners as well, that's a very important thing to understand, because as external examiners, you cannot apply your preference to what the student did. So as long as they can justify their choices, you have to judge them on their on the merit of what they've done, not on what your personal preferences are, or if you would have done it differently. So the paradigm really helps people, and it also makes it then difficult for people to take you on and to judge you for your particular choices, because you have worked within that tradition and within that paradigm. I will allow some questions at the end.
Yes.
Sorry, just want to move on quickly.
Maybe, Franzél, just a quick related one. There's one of the comments here say, in his thesis that he submitted, he had treated pragmatism as a research paradigm, but one of the examiners flatly rejected him. And his argument was that pragmatism is not a research paradigm. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, that is just really sad to hear. And to be honest, that external should be fired, because that is, first of all, nonsense. because there is no such thing that pragmatism is not a paradigm. Pragmatism is a paradigm. And it's really sad for me, and I hope that the student appealed against that, because for me, that is just sad if you, out of ignorance, make a statement that you know absolutely nothing about. So I think that external should have done their homework a little bit as well before they make such a statement. And on the second hand as well, that, you know, like I said, that the student actually appealed it, because if you use pragmatism as your paradigm and you explained it and you explain how it's relevant to your research problem, and that your research problem is a practical one that you are trying to solve, then that should not have happened. Maybe what could have happened was that it ended up being a project instead of a PhD, which is a risk when you work with pragmatic studies, that people then see it as not making an original contribution, that it's just a piece of practical work. So that is a risk. So it's always important to then be able to justify the contribution of your study in that paradigm, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with using pragmatism as a paradigm. And it should not be rejected as a paradigm, because that is not up to the external examiner to decide that. All right. We'll come back to some of your questions just now. In terms of our paradigms, we normally, and it's not always like this, but normally they write it up. We look at epistemology, ontology, they're always there. So epistemology, ontology, methodology, axiology, always there. And then sometimes meta theory is included, other times not. So I just very briefly want to talk to you about what those concepts mean so that they become a little less intimidating. So when we look at the word epistemology, it comes from the Greek, that means from the Greek logos as well as episteme. So wherever you see that ology bit comes from logos, and logos simply means the study of. And episteme means knowledge. So it is the study of knowledge. That's all that epistemology means. So how do we know what we know and what counts as knowledge? And I don't want to go into the debates right now, because some people would say traditional knowledge is not knowledge. So unless it has been verified, unless it's been reliable, valid, all of those kinds of things, it does not count as knowledge or scientific knowledge. So there's these debates that talk about when does something actually count as knowledge. That's what we mean by epistemology. The second one is ontology. So you see the ology again. So ology, logos, the study of, and then ontos means being. So what does it mean to exist? So a little bit of an existential question, but it can also mean what is real or what is reality, what constitutes reality. And you will see that there are different views on what reality is and what constitutes reality and how reality can actually be tested. So I want to pause for a second on ontology, and what I'm going to do today, and this is definitely not their intention. So if you are familiar with the Cannevian model from Snowden, this is not their intention when they use this model like this, but it is one of the lenses that we use at Da Vinci. And I decided that I'm going to apply it to ontology for us for the purpose of this conversation today. So reality then, or what Snowden did was he took systems and he divided them into reality, basically into 4 different domains. And there's actually a 5th one, which I will talk to you about just now. But what he says is that when we look at reality, there are known realities, which he called the simple reality, knowable realities or complicated realities, unknown realities, which are complex, and then unknowable realities, which is chaotic. So when we then look at typically the known and the knowable realities, this is typically where we see reality as being objective. So it's also referred to sometimes as objectivism. So reality is objective, and there's a cause-effect relationship. So it's predictable, it's perceivable, it's repeatable. They're looking for causality. So if we can predict, we can control. So prediction and control very much sits with positivism, post-positivism. And for those of you familiar with modernism, very much a modernist view of how reality works. This is also very much an ordered reality. And that's why when you work in your positivistic paradigms, etc., that is where generalization becomes important, because it's seen as an audit reality, it's objective, it's the same for all, so we can generalize the results to the broader population, and it will be applicable to everyone, regardless of your culture, your background, etc. So on the other hand, on the other side is the unknown and unknowable realities. And in this case, reality is seen as a social construction. So the cause and effect is not perceivable, and it's also not repeatable. So if you study a company, for example, the culture, the everything, the way they do things, a solution in one company may be excellent, but it may not work in the next company because the context is different. So it's very context specific, it's very sensitive to the context. Reality is seen as a social construction, complex, and as I said, sensitive to the context. So for some people, the swear word, but this is very much where the postmodernists sit. So they are the ones who do not believe, the relativists, people who do not believe in objective truths. And for them, reality is very much unordered. So reality is not seen as something that is as ordered as we would like it to be in order to make those predictions and control certain phenomena through those predictions. So very important there, the fifth domain is the disorder domain. And this is what I just briefly want to pause and talk to you about, because disorder happens in two instances. Disorder happens when you try to put something that is, for example, in the complex domain, and you try to oversimplify it by putting it in the simple domain. So you have oversimplified a complex problem, or vice versa. You took something simple and you overcomplicated it by putting it in the complex domain. Another reason why disorder would, why there would be disorder, is if you fail to acknowledge the complexity of reality and that all four of those domains are always in existence. So it's again, it's not about taking sides. It's not about telling people that if you are a postmodernist, you're talking rubbish and you are smoking your socks. It's not about that. People look at different aspects of reality in different ways. So it's again the elephant. So looking at the different parts of reality, but all those parts are always there. And as a student, as a researcher, you don't have to address all of them, but you need to know where your problem is located and why it is part of the knowable reality, or why it is actually part of the unknowable reality or the unknown reality. So it's important to talk to your students about these things, because people often feel, and I remember when I was a student, I felt like I was under enormous pressure to choose a side. And I could see the merits of all the other sides as well. So I was like, well, you know, I don't only believe in the unknown and unknowable reality. Surely there are things that can be predicted and controlled, and surely there is a place for this in research. So I don't want us to feel like we have to choose sides. It's just about justifying which aspect of reality you are going to touch on through your research, and why you are focusing on that, and why that is the best, or why that paradigm is more suitable for that aspect of reality than another paradigm would be. All right. I hope that made sense to you, and that it wasn't too busy. Just something fun that I just quickly want to share with you. Sorry, I am mindful of the time. This is just something on the social construction of reality. So Steve says, woo, it's Friday. No, sorry, Linda says, woo, it's Friday. You excited? So Steve says, any excitement for Friday only proves that you're an unwitting slave to the social construct we call the week. Friday is nothing but a false hope designed to distract you from noticing the machine silently oppressing you. You're just a hamster on a wheel, Linda, too excited by Friday to notice you are in a cage. And then Linda says, this is why nobody likes you, Steve. All right, so just something fun around the social construction of reality and what we mean by that. So a bit more complicated. Sorry, and now maybe it's somebody wants to be admitted. Just go to the next slide. Yeah, so this slide looks very busy. I'm actually going to skip it because it's not so clear. But when we look at paradigms, what you will see is on the outside, we are sitting with our philosophical, the philosophical component, which is our epistemology, ontology, and axiology. So axiology has to do with values. So what do we value? And typically your positivists, post-positivists will value objectivity, whereas interpretativists typically would value things like in-depth understanding. Your critical researchers will value emancipation or equal rights, etc. So it also depends on what it is that you value and that you want to promote through that particular research. Then we have the theoretical component, which makes up our theoretical foundation or our theoretical framework, not to be confused with a conceptual framework. And then we get to our methodology. So all of this will determine what methodology we will use. And that methodology can then be either quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. So, this is a very useful table. I'm not going to go through the detail with you, but for me, this is a very useful table to use because it does give a very brief summary of all those different positions and what they are trying to achieve here. And there is a lovely debate going on at the moment, and I am sorry that we can't have that debate at the moment, but is the post-colonial or indigenous paradigm. So this is an emerging paradigm, and some people argue that it is basically just a combination of critical realism and interpretivism, but it is also interesting to keep an eye on this paradigm as it is emerging and also changing the way we look at knowledge and the type of knowledge that is being produced. Right, so you can see all of this is, like I said, this is a very useful table because it summarizes what is meant by all those different concepts within a particular paradigm. And you can see how they will differ from one paradigm to the next. So a useful tool to use if you want to find a simple way of explaining to people what they are. Another useful tool is the research onion, which I'm sure some of you or most of you are familiar with. So again, working out from the outside, from the philosophy, where we have positivism, critical realism, interpretivism, and pragmatism. And you can see pragmatism is definitely there as a paradigm. Working deductively, abductively, or inductively. And what normally will happen is if it is an interpretive study, people would typically work inductively. And where it is, for example, a positivistic study, people would tend to work more deductively. The different methods, the designs, whether it's the time horizon, in other words, is it cross-sectional or longitudinal, and then looking at our data analysis and collection methods. Now, what I do is I break this thing, I take the onion, so it is actually the onion. I know it doesn't look like the onion, but again, to explain to students how these things need to be aligned. And if you look, for example, at something like positivism, we would work deductively. We typically make use of quantitative research. Then the design would be either a survey or it would be an experimental design, etc. And then our data collection methods, again, survey, measurement scales, experiments, content analysis, structured interviews, etc. The same line, you would want the same line for your interpretivism. So interpretivists normally work inductively, so they like to make use of things like grounded theory. They typically prefer qualitative approaches. Their designs will be things like focus groups, in-depth interviews, etc. And then when we look at their data collection methods, things like narratives, focus groups, textual analysis, etc. So if that line is not there, then you are serving beer with breakfast. So if you are saying that you're doing an interpretive study and you are going to make use of deductive reasoning, you need to be able to justify that. And it's not that it cannot be done, as I said, it's just the tradition, but the tradition would actually typically expect you to be doing inductive research as opposed to deductive research. So if you're not going to do it that way, at least explain and justify why. At the same time, your pragmatism and critical realism, they typically like to make use of mixed methods as opposed to either quantitative or qualitative. So they normally mix quantitative and qualitative methods, again, to give them a better understanding, better picture of reality. Right. Just then another thing to say, the paradigm is actually the toolbox where your methods then would typically be things like observing, interviews, surveys, scales, content analysis, experiments, and focus groups. So your paradigm, as I said, is the toolbox. Within that toolbox, there will be different types of tools, and the tool will also be the thing that you will choose to help you solve your research problem. And it will depend on what the problem is. So if you need to pull something out, then you are not going to use a saw. So the tool that you're going to use needs to be the tool that is going to help you to answer your research question or to solve your research problem. Then just something that I quickly wanted to talk to you about as well is the difference between multi-methods and mixed methods. So a lot of people get confused between multi-methods and mixed methods. So multi-methods is if you make use of more than one data collection method. So if you choose more than one tool to help you to solve your problem. So you can maybe use focus groups and in-depth interviews. That stays a qualitative study. Mixed methods is when you start mixing quantitative and qualitative research. So that's typically where you would have a focus group, or you would have a survey, and then you would have a focus group afterwards to just or to clarify what people answered in the survey, or you will have a focus group and then develop a survey from your focus group. So that would be something like that would typically be seen as mixed methods. So your approach then can be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And what's important here is that if you make use of qualitative research, it's about depth, whereas if it is quantitative, it is about breadth. So we want to generalize in quantitative research. We have large samples in order to do that. In qualitative research, we have small samples. We talk about saturation point, and saturation point can be something like 7 people. So you can have a sample of 7 or even smaller, depending on where your saturation point is. But typically we do not have big samples in qualitative research because it is about the depth, not the breadth. And then an important point that was raised by Prof. Clayton as well is the terminology that we use. So our paradigm is going to tell us what terminology we are going to use. So if it's qualitative, interpretivist, we're talking about trustworthiness. If it is positivistic, post-positivism, we would talk about things like validity and reliability. The same thing with quantitative research. If it's quantitative research, we are looking at validity and reliability, where if it is qualitative, we're going to look at trustworthiness. And again, we combine those if we make use of mixed methods, because we have to be people need to be able to trust our findings, whether it's qualitative or whether it's quantitative. Other people need to be able to trust that the knowledge that we have produced is something that they can believe in, and that it is actually making a contribution. Right, so sorry, I'm just very mindful of the time. So just to summarize then, our research paradigms influences our research strategy as well as our research methods. And we have to know where the paradigm fits in, because that is going to justify our approach, how we approach the problem, where we locate our research. So yes, hopefully then also by understanding our paradigms, our horse will look like the behind and not like the front, and hopefully produce something that is meaningful and worth looking at, as opposed to a very unsophisticated approach from the beginning. Thank you very much. Sorry about rushing. And yeah, maybe if there are any questions that you would like me to answer, there's about 3 minutes left that we can take questions.
Thank you, Franzél. I've been tracking the questions, and I see there's many questions and some of them being answered, and there's some comments. So I think it's a great session. There's many compliments. There were some private messages asking if the session can be repeated and in more depth. So it's a hairy concept that moved to be clarified, or a dog that became a cat. So I think you clarified a lot of these things for us. There's one hand from Mickey and then Simangani that's been up for a while. Mickey first and then Simangani. And looking at the time, we've got 2 minutes, then we need to start the next section. Mickey, do you want to comment or add?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting, fascinating. I much appreciate it. I was just wondering with these paradigms and worldviews you were talking about, and you mentioned one of the aspects was truth and how they treat truth and perspective on truth. Is there a role for disclosing one's theology in your research study? Because I think theology is a worldview, whether it's a biblical worldview or another. Could you please speak to us a little bit about that aspect of theology and how that comes into the research study? Thank you.
Absolutely, and that always causes some really interesting debates, and it's always fun to have those debates. So yes, I think for some people, I don't think, to be honest with you, I'm very much a relativist. So for me, there's no right or wrong answers. For me, it's all about justification. And can you put together a justification for why you want your reader to know that? And if there's a good reason why you want your reader to know, then tell them and justify it and make sure that when you do incorporate it, it's for a reason. So I don't think we should just do things for the sake of doing it. We should always have a reason why we do it, and we should always be able to justify our choices. So that, in a nutshell, is what I would say to you. And I wouldn't have a problem with somebody incorporating it, as long as it is well justified and well argued.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mickey, and thank you, Franzél. If everybody, I see there's any good comments and no more questions, so I'm going to conclude here and say, Franzél, thank you very much. I think you must maybe pull out your biggest slide deck, because there will be a follow-up session if I look at it with more interest. But we appreciate your wisdom and for deconstructing this difficult topic that a lot of people sometimes struggle and understand it and actually simplify it in a visual way, which also helps a lot. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
It's exactly 4 o'clock, so we have 2 more sessions, and we're going to go into the next one, talking about what is a PhD contribution. And for that, we have Professor Mias de Klerk from the University of Stellenbosch Business School here with us. Now, for the people that just joined today and haven't been in the session yesterday, there was quite an interesting discussion going around what's the difference between the various masters and dissertations and short dissertations, and even a question suggesting that you can move from a practical research project very easily into a PhD, and the conclusion where there's sometimes a bit more and we don't know what we don't know. And I think exactly then very appropriate that we have this topic here this afternoon that Mias will take us through. Mias is the head of research at University of Stellenbosch for the doctoral program. His area of specialization is in leadership, behavioral ethics, organization, spirituality, and organizational change and personal transformation. In total, Mias authored and co-authored over 26 created journal articles, 6 chapters in scientific books, and he presented at conferences and delivered many papers. He promoted 5 PhD students till date and supervised more than 120 master students. So Mias is definitely a good person to talk to us about this topic. He also is a regular examiner, national and international. And then lastly, one of the many accolades that Rian have, currently is also the editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Business Management, a D.Ed accredited journal. So Mias, it's a pleasure having you here. This session will run up till 5 o'clock, and then from 10 to 5 till 5 we have questions. And I might stop you if there's a question that's relevant at that slide, if you don't mind. But we're curious to learn more about the PhD contribution and what it entails, and are we really understanding this PhD that Franzél nicely introduced to us, that we fell in love with the moment we saw that slide. Thank you, Mias.
Thank you, Abia. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here with you. Thanks also for this very elaborate introduction. Yeah, we're going to talk about what really makes a contribution, a PhD contribution, and I'll share my screen. I'm going to work from my screen, but if you have questions or comments, please use the chat box. And I prefer to deal with it as we carry on. So let's see what happens. I would like to give credit to Professor Jan Botha from the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at the University of Stellenbosch. Much of what I have here is work that he has done, but I've also tried to change and make it very practical so that we understand what we talk about. Because it is a hairy topic, probably similar to, although different, but a similar kind of hairiness to what Franzél just presented. And there's not a right or a wrong answer. We all have our ideas. And all of you that have been involved in PhD supervision will know that, and especially when you start getting feedback from your external examiners, questioning whether it's a contribution or not. So let's start, let's go through. I'm going to try and make it very practical, although I will start on a theoretical level. So on a theoretical level, let's see what policy documents say. And as I said, I'll start with that and then I'll go more practical. One of the policy guidelines that we have for what is original PhD contribution was developed in the Salzburg seminar. I'm not sure why Salzburg 2005 was actually the Bologna seminar on doctoral programs, but anyway, this is where Jan Botha can explain more. But where they looked at what are the principles of doctoral training. And as you can see on the screen, they talk about, firstly, is the advancement of knowledge. And this is something we must always keep in mind, and I'll deal a lot with that in what I'm going to talk about today. It's not just describing something, it must advance knowledge, firstly. And secondly, it is about original research. It's not just rehashing research that has done, it must be research that makes a new contribution, that's original and advanced knowledge. And then very interesting and very important, I'll come back to this at the end, is it must be something that have an application. And that's specifically for something for the world that we live in at business schools, where the research that we do must have an application wider than just academia, wider than just publishing a thick dissertation and articles in journals that only we read. It must have an application. Salzburg seminar said again in 2010, there they talked about that a doctoral education or doctoral contribution is about a research mindset. So research is very central to what we do in getting a PhD. It's not just, although one can have modules that are taught, there must be the research to it. I like what they say here about nurture flexibility of thought. And I'll come back to it later on, but as a PhD researcher and supervising it, one must be careful for two fixed views on what to get and what's going to happen, how things work. Of course, you must have some view, otherwise you can't develop your proposal. But if you're too fixed and you're not open for what your data tells you, for how things pan out, then you can't go anywhere with it. Which brings in something about creativity and intellectual autonomy. I'll speak more about that just now. And again, the whole idea of original research. And again, in 2016, they looked at it, and here they have a couple of more words that they had in terms of the rigor of the research, the resilience of not just doing any research, but something that has some complexity. Originality is again there, the critical thinking is in there. And then very important what they bring in here is independence. And in terms of PhD supervision, this is something that we must understand very well as PhD supervisors, is this independence of the PhD candidate. We often think that if our PhD candidate fail, that we have failed, and it's our job to bring them to eventually complete their PhD. To the extent that sometimes it is not really a PhD completed by the PhD candidate, but it is something that was done by the supervisor, because we told the PhD candidate exactly what to do, how to do it. That is not a contribution, at least not a contribution by the candidate. It's a contribution by the supervisor. We have to understand that independence is also perhaps a bit of ambiguity, word of ambiguity, because when does providing guidance go over into hindering independence? But the conceptualization of the research, even the conceptualization of the paradigms and the research methods, that must come from the PhD student. We can ask questions, then we can provide them. Okay, there's some noise. If you can just mute, please. Thank you. It must come from the student. We can ask questions. We can say, no, you're on the wrong track. It means this or that, but that independence is very important. And then also, again, we talk about new knowledge. Now, if we get closer to home, if we look at the South African doctoral qualification standard, NQF 10 standard, then firstly, it says there must be a high level of research capability, again, significant on an original academic contribution, a high level, the highest level of holistic and systematic understanding of scholarship and stewardship of the field that's being studied. It means that I must really be a master of the field that I'm working in. I understand it, I understand the complexities of that. The contribution to advances the frontiers of the knowledge, we've talked about that, creating new knowledge. And the frontiers of knowledge may be interdisciplinary, it must be maybe within a specific disciplinary, it can be multidisciplinary, it doesn't matter as long as it adhere to certain of the criteria that I will still discuss.
Me as a question there, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Pilates asking if it's possible if the PhD research can be structured in such a way that one have an impact in the societal challenges that we face at the moment.
Pilates, yes, but, and I'll come back to that now. I mean, in terms of being applied and having applied impact, absolutely yes. But there are many studies that one can do to improve societal challenges, but they don't create new knowledge. It doesn't create new understanding of underlying theories. Then it's not a PhD study. Then it's a good social impact study, but it's not a PhD study. I hope you understand that, but we'll come back to that. Abby, you just mentioned about the master's and PhD research. Now, shortly put, a master's thesis and the different kinds of master's thesis or research assignments. Many schools don't have a master's thesis, but a research assignment. There you must just show that you have mastered the craft of scholarship and mastered the craft of doing research. When you go to a doctoral thesis, you must make the independent contribution that we've talked about, and it must be a new contribution. Here you can see it is about the novelty and originality. It is something new. It expands the knowledge. It must be much more comprehensive. It does not have to be exhaustive. And this is one of the big pitfalls that we often see. It does not have to be exhaustive, but it must be comprehensive in the field that it covers. It must relate to theory building, and theory will come back to what it means, but understanding the system, and that's where I said to Pilates' question, if you do research on something just to improve society, but it doesn't create a better understanding of the underlying theories, the underlying drivers, the underlying interactions, then it's likely not to be a PhD contribution. And we talked about the independent conceptualization already. Now, let's start making it a bit more practical. So, the word originality is very ambiguous. What does it mean? In the natural sciences, it's probably a bit easier to define it. It is new findings, new things that we prove how things work, and therefore we can very easily get new theories, new laws how things work. But in the social sciences, in humanities where we are, it's not that simple. We must get evidence for understanding something. We cannot say it will always work, but this is where the theory comes in. If we understand how something works, and there's sufficient studies that build that, then it can develop into a theory that say, in a certain situation, when certain variables are at play, it is likely that something is going to happen. You can't say it will happen. Originality means we can use new approaches, new theories can come from it, as I've mentioned, new methods, new data that we use, topics that are important, especially in understudied area, and I'll come back to the question we had on Tuesday on what does the gap mean. And all of this leads to new findings and understandings. So something else that they say in terms of originality, it does not have to have a universal definition, or original does not have an original definition, but and doesn't work the same way, but it's got certain tentacles, and one of it can be originality in terms of the phenomenon that we study. But if we study a phenomenon, then we cannot just focus our study on the outcome of what is happening, describing what's happening. We must also understand the process that makes something to happen. Now, let me give you an example. Yeah. Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry. So let me give you an example. And these are, what I show you are titles of proposed PhD studies. In most of the cases, they didn't really happen. And I know a title is a gross, assumption of what the study is all about. The title shouldn't be too long. But so I'm really using it as an indication to explain what I mean, because we just don't have the time to look at the whole proposal. Now, this was a title of assessing the impact of Uber on the African taxi industry, describing this phenomenon, impact of Uber on African taxi industry. Now, from what I've just talked about, the question is, what's the underlying theory? What are the underlying drivers? I cannot just, by studying this phenomenon, this outcome of the impact of Uber on the taxi industry, without understanding the antecedents, the drivers, how it relates to certain theories of behavior, certain theories of financial aspects, and so on. It is likely not to be a PhD contribution because I don't advance knowledge. I just do a very good description. And the other one is smart shopping, the adoption of grocery shopping apps during COVID-19 pandemic. Again, just looking at this outcome without looking at the process that produce this outcome, the theories, the antecedents, the drivers, I am not building new knowledge. I must understand the relationships that contribute to this outcome, the comparisons that contribute to it. PhD research is always explanatory, and it doesn't have to be exhaustive explanatory, but it tells me, it helps me explain why this happened. Now, when we talk about a theory, as I said, I'll come back to it. It's very simple. What is a theory? It's a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially based on general principles, independent of the thing to be explained. And this is what I say, unless that also come in here, the system of ideas that explain why it's happening, it is unlikely to be a PhD contribution. If I, for instance, take another study, and this is probably too long title for a PhD, but if you say, okay, it's not just explaining the effect of COVID, but it's the impact of working exclusively from home. So it's not just related to COVID. On employment engagement and employee experience, so you bring in certain theories. What's beneficial, what's distracting, and what's the potential impact on the future world of work. Now you sit with something that's relevant, it's original, but it also have much wider impact and application than just studying it in one very isolated case. So this will be something that I would much rather say is a PhD contribution that one can work on. My colleague, Prof. Charlene Gerber, also say research always is either a relationship or a comparison. Now, I'm not going to go into that in detail, but coming back to the underpinning theory, it's important in PhD research that we either explore the relationships or the comparisons. X relate to Y because, or X influences Y because. And of course, we all know the difficulty of inferring causality and how difficult it is to measure causality. So be careful for that. A comparative study, for instance, a nice one that I have here, the comparative analysis on entrepreneurial ecosystem on BRICS club countries, practical emphasis of Africa. This is a comparative study and it may become a PhD contribution. But the question is, why? What are driving different entrepreneurial ecosystems in different countries? And what does it mean for a group like BRICS? Or what does it mean for a country? Again, if you don't go there, you don't go far enough. And it's probably not a PhD contribution. We talked about new findings and getting a better understanding. One must be very careful that in terms of getting a PhD focus, is not generalizable. And this is what we often get, and it has been mentioned this week before, the consultancy projects. And I see it so often in proposed PhD studies. For instance, future-proofing of company A through the exploration of a coaching culture for millennials to improve customized competency, or develop a competency framework, or however you want to frame that. This is a consultancy project that relates to only one company. And it doesn't mean that we always have to study more than one company, but this one is looking at what are the situations in company A and how can you improve a situation in company A. If you change this around and you look at how a coaching culture for millennials can improve the effectiveness of organizations or the effectiveness of individuals, and you study it in company A, then you have much more something that can be a PhD contribution, because it does have some generalizability. We know that we have to be pragmatic as faculty, as academics. We just can't always study a specific phenomenon or a specific process in more than one company. So often we do it in one company. We acknowledge that limitation in the limitations at the end of the study, but we still can have a different contribution. And this brings me to the whole issue of context. And this has also been mentioned before this week. Should we always say where the study is done, especially in, I'm talking about in the problem statement, in the title, in the research question. For instance, this topic we discussed last week in the African Academy of Management conference at length. Institutional and organizational influences on the adoption of sustainable practices among hotels in Zanzibar. Now, the first question is, why hotels? If you want to add something like among hotels in Zanzibar to your study, to your problem statement, then you have to define and very clearly motivate why hotels are probably different than any other industry. That hotels are different than other aspects of the tourism industry. Why is Zanzibar different than Cape Town? Why is it different from Mombasa? And unless you do that, it's unlikely that you can go very far with this PhD study. And if you do this kind of study, if we as a supervisor allow students to do this, the question is, what is a generalizability? Did we build any new knowledge outside this very narrow scope? The next one we also discussed last week, indigenous leadership on the Oromo people of Ethiopia and exploration and measurement validation. Very focused. Why? So what? Who cares? But if you change this now and say you want to study indigenous leadership, the effectiveness of specific indigenous leadership practices, or what are the indigenous leadership characteristics? And then you say, okay, the Oromo people in Ethiopia gives me a good place to study it because Ethiopia has not been colonized and therefore have been influenced less than other westernized or colonized countries. Of course, there will be impact in terms of what people watch on TV and so on. So one can't say that they have not been contaminated, but they've been less than other places. And therefore, it's a good place to study indigenous leadership to understand and a phenomenon better that we can also apply elsewhere. Then you probably have a PhD study, but not as we have it there. And the same one for the Limpopo province, the next one. Build it wider. What is the underlying theory? And how does it contribute to theory of social media in rural communities and the use of social media by rural communities, not just in the mining industry and not just in Limpopo. Okay. What we often also see, especially in Africa and South Africa, is the Me Too studies. Just say, I'm going to assess this person's model of theory in Africa because it hasn't been studied in Africa before. That is not a PhD contribution. Repeating a study just in a different place, in a different setting with a different example, does not build new knowledge. It doesn't contribute to theory, and therefore it is not considered to be a PhD contribution. Significance and relevance. Always ask yourself the question and let your PhD student ask themselves the question, who cares? Because a PhD study must contribute to something that is worthwhile. And again, I have the same example of the indigenous leadership in the Oromo people. Question is, who cares? Unless you can show me how these findings from your research also apply elsewhere, it's probably 100 people that will care about the study. And that makes that it's probably something that we won't consider as a PhD contribution. It must have a wider implication in terms of the theory and so on, as I've already mentioned. On the other hand, we must also guide ourselves against the fallacy of Nobel Prize-worthy contributions. I know myself, and I think many people online tonight, when I started my PhD, especially when I was starting to do my actual research, I said, yes, this is going to be so great. I'm going to get a Nobel Prize for this. Well, firstly, I had to realize later on I didn't get my Nobel Prize. Secondly, it's not, a PhD does not have to be Nobel Prize worthy. And indeed, most of us don't get it. It must make a contribution, as I've discussed, but it's a small contribution. It's another brick in the wall of our understanding. And the very famous quote of, I believe it was Sir Isaac Newton who said it in the 1600s, is standing on the shoulder of giants. Because I stand on the shoulder of a giant, I can see a little bit further than what that person could see. I doesn't have to be able to see everything, but I can see a little bit further, and therefore I make a contribution. And our PhD studies should stand on the shoulders of giants, see a little bit further, build a little bit more theory, combine a few more things, and we understand better. But then again, it must provide a deep understanding and explanation of the new knowledge or extending previous knowledge. It must be not obvious, and we must be inquisitive. If something that we study as a PhD is so obvious, then why study it? And then it's not a PhD. And remain inquisitive. Ask yourself why this happens. How does it happen? I've seen many proposals of PhD that say, the purpose of this PhD is to prove that or to show that. That means that you're not inquisitive as a PhD candidate. And as a supervisor, I should not allow it, because we never get, or almost never get, the kind of results that we expect to get, as we know. Because life is just too complex. And I like that complexity diagram that Franzél showed us. We must understand when things apply, where they apply, how they apply. And then in the same vein, be complex, but also be realistic in your studies and what you supervise. And there's what we call at USB the typical world peace projects. Almost a Nobel Prize worthy projects. The projects where somebody almost wants to create world peace. And the example I have there is the development and implementing ethical entrepreneurial business strategies in response to current African problems. This is just too wide, too big, too many tentacles. I mean, through one study, you cannot solve all entrepreneurial business problems in Africa. It must become focused. This is not realistic. So make sure that it's realistic. I have a specific notice here on measurement development. Measurement development, and many students want to do it, and a measurement development can be something that's very useful for as part of a PhD research, but on its own, it is unlikely that it's a sufficient contribution to a PhD. Because it is one specific way that we do it. Does it contribute to new understanding and new theory? Is it just a new instrument to measure something that we already have been measuring with other instruments? So I will be careful for a PhD study that just want to do measurement development. And then the gap, mind the gap. What we often see in research proposals is that a student would say, the gap is that there's no research on this in Africa. Or maybe there's no research on this in general. That doesn't make it that there's a gap. That just says there's no research. Maybe there's no research on it because it's not worthy of studying. You have to explain why this gap, or what this gap is, and why it is important. And why is it important to close this gap? Now, there was one PhD proposal of somebody who wanted to study the effects of reward equity on propensity of creative contributions. Now, reward equity have been studied for decades. It really has been done way too much. And I don't say that there's nothing we can learn about it anymore, but then you have to be very clear in terms of what kind of gap are you going to close when you study reward equity, because it's unlikely that most studies will bring in anything new, any new gaps that will be closed. We know reward equity doesn't work. It's a demotivator. It's not a motivator. What you're going to bring to the table. Whereas the other one, and I'm not an expert in this field, and I don't know how much has been researched in it, but it just sounds to me much more a gap that somebody can and should research. The impact of environmental uncertainty, dynamism and dynamic capabilities to create a competitive advantage. So that thing, I think, that topic, I think, is much more worthy. We've talked about this underlying theories enough. Now this topic, the first one here, is it creating new knowledge, or is it just a different application of old knowledge? And one of my colleagues and I had a very good conversation around this topic, developing a coaching framework for emotional intelligence development in frontline managers. And I must admit, I have a bit to be in my bonnet about developing coaching frameworks, because everyone who does a PhD or a master's on coaching wants to develop a new framework. My concern is we're developing new frameworks based on old science, not creating new knowledge just to do something else. A framework for emotional intelligence, a framework for that, a framework for that. But what's the underlying theory? What new knowledge do we create except for just another framework? The next one, I think, is much closer to a worthy contribution, and I have to confess, this is one that I'm currently supervising with Prof. Salome, who's also online. But it does have certain theories, certain underlying theories, and it can bring a wider contribution by creating a different kind of knowledge. It's not just a new coaching framework. To mind the gap, to understand the gap, and it's been said on Tuesday already, it's important that the PhD candidate immerse themselves in the literature, but not just the literature, the meaning of the literature. You can do a wonderful systematic review of something, but if you don't understand the meaning of that literature, of what you've done your systematic review on, then you still don't know what is the issue, why is it an issue, and why is this issue worthy of a PhD research. So it's very important to push your PhD candidate to really get into that depth of knowledge. So I think we're getting to the close of what I want to say. We already talked about creating another brick in the wall, standing on the shoulder of giants, applying new methods or techniques, creating new syntheses, connecting new theories, connecting new or existing theories sometimes, new implications, new evidence. It's not about replicating work just in a different place or a different time, but it is a great, or it can be a novel way to work with existing theories. Talking about Africa, and there was the question about the importance of research for Africa. Again, it is very important that we have our research have some application into creating better organizations in Africa or helping people in Africa. We are in the business world as business schools. And of course, this does not only apply to direct business or public sector, it can be NGOs, it can be how the business impacts society, but it must have that impact. So let's do our doctoral research to our real problems in Africa with using theories that we have. If we have to create new theories, by all means, let's do it. But mostly theories don't change across cultural settings. They apply just differently. So think of it. Let's bring an African flavor into it. Expose yourself to other African universities. As I said, I attended the African Academy of Management workshop last week, and I was amazed by the knowledge we have in Africa, the scholarliness we have in Africa, and how we can learn from our other colleagues in the rest of Africa. It may be, we talk about independence, it may be that because of certain legacies in Africa, whether it was through apartheid or for colonization, whatever, that as PhD supervisors, we have to provide a bit more guidance initially, but be careful not to take over from your student. You're not doing him or her a favor. So keep helping them to do the research, but keep helping them to be independent. Then to conclude, this slide, nothing new. It's just summarizing everything that we've said. And then my colleague Jan Botha developed this model, which I think is very useful. What is contribution research? It's about originality, creativity, innovative research. I've added the two words in terms of depth and complexity. And with that, HB, I would like to get more into a conversation. I couldn't see messages.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Mias. It seemed to rule out meta studies for PhD study. A question there by Koos Keizer when we look at the diagram. I just invited people, and please, post questions or raise your hand. Mias, you mentioned that it's important to stand on the shoulders of giants. And I look at the audience and I see there are many giants here, but I think those giants all stood on your shoulders today. So thank you very much for demystifying and taking us through, the contribution of the PhD study. I think there's many thoughts and angles that we need to go and ponder and think about and take further. There were some comments in terms of questions, and some of them were answered by the delegates. Thank you very much, colleagues. Any specific question to Mias?
If I can just respond to Koos's comment. Koos, it does not rule out meta-studies. But if you do a meta-study without creating new understanding, then it's ruled out. If you just describe the situation better by doing a meta-study, it's not a PhD study, but that is in most cases not what we mean by a meta-study. Through meta-studies, we actually want to improve our understanding of the knowledge because now we synergize the knowledge that is already there to see what does actually underline all of these study that's available. So it can be a PhD study. I don't know if I make myself clear on that. Mickey?
That makes sense. Thank you, Mias. There's a hand raised by Prof. Mickey Chasimiris. Mickey, your question?
Thank you. Thank you. Very insightful. Appreciated. Just perhaps you could share with us a little bit. Do you see any difference between the Doctor of Business Administration and the PhD? Do you have any difference? But do you see any difference? What would your guidance be? Thank you.
Mickey, I'm not an expert in that. I can tell you what I think and how I think about it, but I may be wrong. But the PhD tend to be stronger theoretically focused, developing new theories, whereas the DBA is more about the application without building new theory and creating new knowledge. That's how I understand it, but if somebody else online have a better understanding, please tell us how and inform us much better.
Mickey, do you have a view on that?
Thanks for your answer. I'll leave it open to the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I see there's a comment, students quite often confuse a title of a study with a topic, which is very valid. But Elmarie, I hope it's Elmarie because there's more than one Elmarie. It might be somebody on a name, but let's see, it's Elmarie. Does she agree with the depth and the complexity? But she asked a question about its width. How wide must the river be without losing your rigor and your depth in your discussion, Mias?
Per definition, and I think somebody said it on Tuesday, if I remember correctly, per definition, a PhD is more about depth than width or breadth. But having said that, be careful in terms of depth that you don't over-focus. For instance, studying leadership just as it applies to the Oroma people, as I've mentioned. It must still have a much wider implication and application in terms of the theory that you build and in terms of the knowledge that you build. That is where the breadth comes in, rather than trying to cover too many things.
Yeah, because you must realize that as the apex qualification, if you go and look at the national doctoral standard, you must be on top of the game. Hence, you get promoted into a PhD and not really graduated, if you use the correct words. So you cannot just be a jack of all trades. You need to be specialized. In developing or formulating a PhD topic, what are the basic steps that one can follow? And that's a question from Anne.
And I often get students approaching me with this question, or they approach me and say, okay, what areas do you want to research? What topics would you like to be researched? Or what topics are important to your school to research? We want to do our PhD there. And if that happens, I won't say chase them away, but I chase them back and say, I don't know. Go and immerse yourself in the material. Go and start reading. Look at what has been written in something that interests you. And let your topic emerge from your reading. Let your gap emerge from your reading. And something that is relevant, as I've said, that is worthy of research, and something that is of particular interest to you as an individual. The fact that I want research on a specific topic does not mean that it's important to you. And we all know that in a PhD, the effort that goes in, the emotional labor that goes in, the emotional almost trauma that goes into doing it, unless your topic speaks to you personally, you're going to give up. You will not be able to push it through. So my big thing in terms of a topic is go and read and let it emerge from what you're reading.
Thank you, Mias. I see Salome say that if you don't have passion, you will run out of steam very quickly. Very, very wise words. Any questions maybe? If anybody want to raise their hand to unmute themselves, please do. We still have another 5 minutes, 7 minutes to go. We only start the next session at 5 past, so we have some time to answer questions. And if otherwise, we can take a quick coffee break, but let's use this opportunity for questions. If a student does not have enough passion, yeah, okay, topic will run off stream. Any questions to Mias? Mias, I once were in a conversation where somebody said, you know, when most students enroll for a PhD, they don't necessarily know what they don't know, and they almost grow into your PhD, and that's what you've just said. Reflecting on those words of yours, are there any experience what you can give to the colleagues in the room as a supervisor, how to assist the student to really grow into that PhD by reading and reflecting? Are there any concrete steps over and above to that, guiding them through that process?
I think what I would add is when somebody approached me and they say they want to do a PhD, my first question is why? Why do you want a PhD? And I mean, people won't say often, it's because of the title and so on, but for many it is. But if you don't, what my supervisor taught me is wonder and be inquisitive. Start worrying about things. If you have too many answers, you're on the wrong track. Start thinking about things. Ask yourself questions, because a PhD is about getting better understanding. Also what we get, and Salome and I worked on a person, and the other day we had to say to the person, look, your PhD is not going to make you a better coach, because it was a coaching student. Your PhD is not going to make you a better coach. It's going to help you understand the coaching process better, and maybe eventually you'll be able to coach better. But the PhD is to be inquisitive. What makes it work? What are the variables at play? How do you bring things in? What's the process? So what I will recommend is try and find out why people will do, and unless they are inquisitive, try and get them out of it.
No, that's very true. I see there's a question by Pearl, and I'm not quite sure I follow, that it does in the PhD and the DBA. What is the contribution of a PhD by publication? So maybe, Pearl, if you can explain yourself, the PhD have a specific format. It's not like a MBA versus a MCOM versus a MPhil, unless you mean the publication, the article route.
I think that's what Pearl means, going the article route.
Well, you're unmuted. You can elaborate on that.
Actually, I'm not in a position where I can talk properly, but yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Okay.
I wanted to understand.
Thank you, Paul.
So, Paul, the PhD by publication or article route is becoming very popular in some fields. It is frowned upon by some examiners, but it is becoming more and more accepted. What's important that if you do a PhD by publication is that your 3 or 4 or 5 publications, there must be a golden thread between them. It cannot be loose-standing publications. And then that golden thread must be very clear, and you must still put those publications together in one final dissertation with an introduction and with a conclusion at the end, so that there is a thread going through it, and so that you can show as a whole they contribute to the contribution of creating new knowledge. If you do that, the PhD by publication is viewed similarly as the PhD by dissertation, or the full dissertation, the thick book that we all know.
The thesis, yeah. And I think that ties with the question between the different kinds of PhD, on the CSE regulations. It's clear that between the distinction between academic and a professional, and it's acknowledged based on admission requirements, there's different fields of entry. So maybe that Pradeep will guide you in that one. there's a question on Mias. How do you assess when a student has reached the required depth? In essence, maybe rephrase that. How do we know if they're at the doctoral standard? What is the doctoral standard? And last year was this the national review, and we're looking forward to that report. But that's the question on the table.
Okay, lovely question. When I discuss the topic with a student, and the students don't say, I believe, or I think, but the students say, okay, the Klerk said this and this and this in that article, but Klopper said that in that article. And these two views contradict each other. Perhaps one should look at the work of Sadler, because she said this and this and this, and this helped me to better understand. Now you can hear a scholarly conversation coming from the student, rather than I think, I believe, this is how things work. When that happens, then the student is making progress in terms of emerging themselves in the literature.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mias, look like we reached the end of the session. I don't see any questions or hands, so I want to thank you really much. It was a very informative session. I think everybody enjoyed that by looking at the questions and responses. And it's a topic that we definitely ask, so what's in a PhD? And you clarified it for us very nicely. The slides and the recording will be available on the SABSA website. And you know that will for download. Before we close, there's one more question. Can the depth be measured by the number of citations per page? At the end, you know, it's a lot of people become verbal diarrhea with all the citations. It's about the argument that you bring forward. But that being said, you cannot just have one or two sources. It must be a conversation, a scholarly conversation, deepening the discourse, as Mias pointed out. So I'm going to ask that we take a break here. Our next session will start at 7:05, so everybody can go and fetch a quick cup of coffee, take a comfort break, and then we will be back at starting at 5:05 exactly. So 5 past 1700 hours, 5:05, which is in 9 minutes from now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mias. Good afternoon, ladies and gents, colleagues and friends, or should I say good evening. We now entered the last slot of today on the PhD session, and it will be facilitated by our colleague, Professor Ralph Hamman, from the UCT School of Business. And the topic, as you saw in the program, is all about the literature review and how central that is to your study. And Rolf is the ideal person to talk about that with his experience. And if I say experience, if you can allow me a quick introduction of Rolf. Rolf mainly focus on business strategy, sustainable collaborative governance, social entrepreneurship, and innovation. He's rated an internationally acclaimed researcher by the NRF and has numerous scholarly publications, including in highly ranked journals such as the Journal of Business Venturing and also the Journal of Management Studies. Rolf is one of those people that managed to proceed from research into practice, and a good testimonial of that is his acknowledgement as the editor of the Environment, Science and Policy for Sustainable Development, and also being the co-founder of the South African leg of the embedding project of the South African Food Lab, two award-winning programs, which Rolf is very proud of to be associated. Besides being a seasoned academic, experience in supervising and publications, of which you have many, Rolf's also a visiting professor recently to the engineering entrepreneurship at Brown University in the USA, and is also a research fellow at the Institute for Mittelstandsforschung in Germany. And Rolf is here this afternoon to share with us his view, and it will take us all the way till 5 to 6, at which stage we will conclude the session. If we have any questions, please post them in the chat box, and I will facilitate them and stop Rolf where it is, and we will handle them as we go along. And then by 6 o'clock, we will wrap it up. There's a little questionnaire at the end that we just test your experience and thoughts on the day. And then we'll have our last session tomorrow morning, and we will post the topics in there. But now it's all about the literature review that builds very nicely on Mias's discussion on what is in a PhD that's being founded on the research paradigm, explained and introduced to us by Franzél earlier this afternoon. So Rolf, we have many questions, but we will post them in the chat and I'll follow it for you. Floor is yours, all over to you. Looking forward to your wisdom this afternoon.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clearly. Thanks, Rolf.
Great. Well, thanks so much for this opportunity. It's a really great initiative. So I want to just also shout out to SABSA for organizing this and Da Vinci for hosting it. I think it's a really wonderful initiative, and hopefully something to build on in the future. Also, thank you to the speakers in the session that went before. I have, I think, quite a few points that build or connect at least with the themes that have already been addressed. Not so much paradigms, but there are some touch points, and of course, quite a bit on the issues of contribution that Mias has been talking about. So I'm really grateful to them for setting the scene so wonderfully, and finally also to the participants. I think I've appreciated the questions that have been raised in the discussions, but also in the chat. So I'm hoping that some of those questions can also be addressed in this final part of the session. For instance, a couple of people have been asking about the relationship between theoretical and practical impact. And so please feel free to keep it coming in terms of the comments and questions. I think they're really very, very useful for everyone to see what's on your mind and what you want to share and what you want to ask. Okay, so I've been up since 5 this morning, so it's a bit of a caveat. Hope I'm going to make sense. And we've had painters here in the room next door. So if I seem like I'm on drugs, then you know why that is the case. But enough of the caveats. I'm going to share my screen and put this into play mode. So I'm hoping that you can see this. Yes, we can see it, Rolf.
Thank you.
All right, so this is what the suggested topic is that I'll speak to, and I'm addressing you primarily as supervisors, and so I'm going to basically go through a bunch of points, and they add up to 7 recommendations, and they're based on my own personal experience and of course my work in reading and so on. they're quite personal in a way. It's my, the way that I've developed my repertoire of supervising, and I'm very happy for you to suggest alternatives or perhaps, also some concerns that you might have with any of the suggestions I have. I definitely don't, I'm not wedded to any of these things, though I have found them to be quite helpful in getting a student to the finish line in a, in a way that all of us are really happy and proud of the outcome. So I'm going to launch right in. I think the first recommendation that I would make is that your role as a supervisor is to help clarify the purpose of a PhD and of the literature review within that PhD. And I think it's quite interesting that people actually commence with a PhD, and especially in our first workshop at the GSB, we have a series of workshops in the first year. And, I spent a lot of time in that first workshop just going on and on about what it is that we're actually trying to do in a PhD, because it's quite intriguing to me that students don't always know what they've gotten themselves into, to be honest. That is getting better, by the way. A couple of years ago, there was a lot more kind of diversity of views. I think, perhaps as a program also develops a reputation, it attracts students that are on a similar kind of page. So I mean, I'm building obviously here on Mias quite a bit. He's already spoken to some of this, and I'm not going to, open this up for discussion. We could have a little bit of a conversation. Well, how do you define the purpose of a PhD for your students? I'm not going to do that because it's too close to what Mias was talking about. I'm going to give you one version of a possible answer to that question. A PhD is a self-directed, supervised research project aimed at making a theoretical contribution. So I think the first two adjectives I think are relevant here because there's a bit of a paradox, right? The student is self-directing her or himself, but at the same time is supervised. And that begins to already speak to this quite interesting role of a supervisor, where you are you're kind of participating in the co-creation of a knowledge product, as well as a guide, a kind of a coach and facilitator of a process. And at the same time, clearly you need to make sure that it's the student who's doing the bulk or the essence of the work, rather than you yourself as supervisor. But the more interesting aspect here is the theoretical contribution. So a literature review is very much at the core of a PhD because it allows you, or it sets up the possibility of making a theoretical contribution. And also, by the way, when I'm talking about literature review, I'm not talking about a particular stage in the PhD. You commence your PhD on day one, 3 or 4 or 5 years later, you submit your PhD. Throughout that process, in my view, you are conducting literature review. I must also add, I'm mostly an inductive qualitative researcher. So that is particularly the case, that you keep reviewing literature throughout the process. Perhaps if you are a deductive hypothesis testing kind of researcher, then there's a more of an emphasis on the literature review in the beginning, and then perhaps at the end when you're trying to, write up the contributions. But on the whole, I'm talking about the project from beginning to end. So what is a theoretical contribution? Again, Mias has addressed some of this. I'm not going to go into it in much detail, but I'll give you a very kind of concise suggestion. It's a novel, parsimonious, convincing, and general argument about why or how something happens. And so novelty and all that has been talked about by Mias. I think parsimonious is also a useful thing to bear in mind. It should be as short and sweet as possible. Convincing, of course, is a key aspect of the methodological requirements around validity and reliability and so on, and rigor. And generalizability is something that Mias also has spoken about. I want to focus a bit on the second line here, which is that basically we are talking about two kinds of contributions here, actually, because the argument is the theoretical contribution. Yes, you're making an argument to a scholarly audience that is expecting a theoretical contribution. But that's something that you're trying to explain that is going to be probably relevant to practitioners, right? Especially in our field, as professional schools and business schools and so on, we do address issues that are a lot of the times have organizational consequences, and especially managers, but also other stakeholders of organizations, investors, policymakers, etc., will hopefully find those those arguments about how and why something happens useful to them. So I'm going to, take the stance that there isn't, that we shouldn't overplay the distinction between theoretical and practical contribution, because in the bigger scheme of things, those things ideally should be interrelated and co-constitutive. In other words, they kind of generate and support each other. So another model that I'm going to just suggest, which I've kind of developed off the back of a really useful chapter by Maxwell, which I can recommend to those that want to have a nice overview of this research design. It's with an emphasis on qualitative research, but I think it finds it's used quite effectively also in quantitative methods. But the framework says, you have a practical problem, and then you have a theoretical gap or problem. And so in South Africa, my experience is that many PhD students, at least at the GSB, this is the case, a lot of them come into a PhD program with a strong sense of a practical problem. This is a little bit different in US or some European schools, where actually quite a few of them are so kind of socialized in theoretical thinking that they actually start with theoretical problems, and then they find a practical problem to illustrate that theoretical issue. Here in South Africa, it's generally a different story. We start often with a practical issue, and then basically we go into the literature to say, well, what do we know about this issue in the literature? And what don't we know about this issue? And what don't we know is the gap or problem that we can then address in our study. Both of those two things on the top, they then influence what kind of research question we identify, and also how we then frame that question, what kind of words we use in that question, and what kind of units of analysis and so on. The bottom of the diagram is more about the methodological aspects, and that's not really in the scope of today's session, so we'll leave that. So clearly the literature review really focuses on theory, and sometimes students are a little bit resistant to that, especially if they have a strong practical orientation, and they ask why theory. And that's also where I think quite a lot of work needs to be done as a supervisor or as a PhD program, because I think one of the key challenges in a PhD is to get the student to develop that muscle to think theoretically. It is a very different way of thinking about the world. And funnily enough, I sometimes have students that have a very illustrious career in companies as managers, executives, or whatever. And they think, I've mastered basically the way of thinking about things. I'm a very diligent and disciplined worker. I'm going to do this PhD in 3 years. And ironically, those people sometimes struggle the most because they are so embedded in a practical way of thinking. They find it particularly difficult to develop a theoretical thinking muscle. And so I tell them this, and they think, what's this guy talking about? And like 2 years later, they come to me and say, now I know what you tried to say to me 2 years ago. I sometimes think it's a little bit like playing tennis. You play with your right hand, and the better you play tennis with your right hand, the more difficult it is for you to swap hands and play with your left hand. And it's a little bit like the kind of thing that we need to help students develop, like really use a different kind of brain functioning. So why theory? Well, it's basically what's required in terms of what a good PhD is. I know there's a difference between theoretical contribution and contribution to knowledge, which is what some universities have in their requirements. But especially if you want to get into good journals, especially in the MOS space, you do need a theoretical contribution in those good journals. But of course, that is not really a very, let me say, compelling or strong motivation just because somebody else wants us to do this. I think the more important reason is because theory has impact. It impacts on how people think, and if you can impact how people think, then you are also impacting on how they act. And so Kurt Lewin mentioned this well-known quote here: "Nothing is quite so practical as a good theory," and I think there's a lot to be said about that. So then, how do we then take it forward from theory to the kind of practicalities of doing a lit review? I think the first step that I want to recommend to you is to help the student recognize scholarly work as contributing to a scholarly conversation. And there's a really wonderful book that I recommend you have a look at. You can read it in a day. It's one of these very easy books to read. In fact, it includes a bunch of exercises. So it's written for students. It's not written for seasoned academics. It's a really practical book to read, and students find it very useful. And so she makes this point that scholarly work is rooted in the lively exchange of ideas, conversation at its base. So in essence, I use this analogy for students to think about what does it take to be a constructive participant in a conversation, whether it's at a dinner party, whether you're having tea with friends, or a cocktail party like this picture here. And think about scholarship like that. You're having a conversation where there's a lively exchange of ideas, and you build on each other's ideas to improve basically the general state of knowledge about a particular thing. That involves agreement, but it can also involve disagreement. It can be polite. Sometimes it's a little bit robust. So you have these different temperaments that all pop up in a conversation. The other thing that this analogy can help us to do is that if you recognize scholarship as conversation, you need to give a lot of attention to what conversation you want to participate in. And I say to people, especially if you're a newcomer, right? You don't just rock up at a party like this and tell everybody to shut up because you have something new to say, because that just doesn't work, right? You need to, you go into the room and you figure out where is a table where the people are having a conversation that is of interest to you, where you can then make a contribution to that conversation. And you don't just rock up at the table and tell everybody to be quiet because you have something important to say. You listen, right? You listen, you understand where the conversation is coming from, where the flow of the conversation is going, and then you can make different kinds of contributions. You can make incremental contributions by adding, a useful bit of information or a fact, or you can make a more significant contribution by actually changing the flow of conversation. So one of the first implications of recognizing scholarship as conversation is because you can help the student focus on a salient conversation. And one of the ways to see that is to say, to help the student think about this as a kind of a party, but it's not, you don't even take for granted that you know what party you're going to, right? So you almost have this option of choosing, what suburb you're going, and that's maybe the discipline, and then what party you want to go in that suburb, and that's the kind of domain within that discipline or that subfield or something like that. And then within that, you have different conversations, which is represented by these different tables in this case. That focus is really important because you cannot participate effectively in different conversations, especially as a novice researcher. Maybe if you've been doing this for 30 years, then you've had a chance to, then you can jump around from one table to another a little bit, right? But even then it's tricky because every table has a history and you can't always tell where that conversation has come from and where it might be going. The other aspect to this, and I've already mentioned this, is you can help consider the kind of posture that it takes to contribute to a conversation. So you need to understand the genealogy or the traditions that are relevant in a conversation. So I think Franzél described this nicely in terms of paradigms constituting certain traditions in a conversation. And your job as a student is to understand in some ways those conventions and those traditions in order to maintain coherence within your study and between your study and the conversation that you are joining. So here's another extract from Anne Huff's book. Critical questions that she says you should answer are, what conversation should I participate in? And the second point is the key one here, which is, who are the important conversants? So the next step that you need to do as a supervisor is help the student identify the key conversants that she or he is going to be responding to in the proposal initially, right, when he's writing the proposal, and then of course in the thesis eventually as well. And you know, Anne Huff actually talks about conversants as scholars. I find it quite useful to recommend the selection of particular articles or chapters, but generally speaking articles, because they constitute in some ways a contribution to a conversation that you can then build on. So a scholarly conversation is different to a cocktail party because the utterances, so to speak, the inputs into that conversation are generally speaking in the form of scholarly articles. And so that's really the key thing that we want to understand. And so in the introduction, for instance, right, of a thesis, the first 3 pages, I want to be able to tell what are the 3, 4, or 5 articles that constitute the foundation for what this is all about. And if that is scattered all over the place, then I know there's warning signals. So I think we're kind of well 2/5 of the way through. So I'm going to mention, I'm going to put up a slide now that is representing a very real list of possible conversants that first-year students in an exercise in our workshops submitted to me, right? So here it is. And so this is maybe an opportunity where we can have a little bit of kind of discussion. And my question to you is that if these are the suggested conversants, as I've described this, right? Do you think this is a helpful, useful?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Go ahead. Do you want to make a comment about this?
Nazima? No, I think she's just testing a sound, Rolf. You're welcome to continue.
Okay, well, who is up for giving some feedback to the student who is submitting these as conversants? What is your view of this? If this is the foundation of his or her proposal?
Anybody that wants to respond to that question of Rolf?
And thanks for the help, by the way, because I can't see the participants when I'm sharing screen.
No, that's fine. You can.
Rolf, can you just repeat the question, please?
If a student gives you this list here, that's on the slide, as a list of key conversants, what is your response?
Well, they're not academic at all.
Yeah. And how would you define that?
Well, they're not scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles for a start.
Yep, there you go. And thank you also to those of you that are putting it into the chat. Quite a few of you, like Julia, is pointing out they're not scholarly. Suzette, also same point. Arthur is adding that these are often kind of consulting oriented. So the point here is to help the student recognize what we actually mean by the scholarly literature, right? So I'm just adding here theory-based, peer-reviewed scholarly articles. These and what I want to be clear is that the examples here are not, and I'm not being negative about these books or whatever they are, right, or reports. They have a different purpose and a different audience. Their purpose is not to build or test theory, and the audience is not scholars, right? These references and the authors of these documents here, they are targeting practitioners generally, and they are addressing a very practical issue. And they might be fantastic books, right? Very popular, very, they probably made a lot of money, especially the Stephen Covey one, right? But they are not trying to be academic. And that includes the HBR article, by the way, right? Harvard Business Review papers are, they do get cited quite a bit especially if it's Michael Porter and so on. But even their audience is practitioners. It's not so much scholars. So that's an important thing. And I think from your comments, it's clear that's already been on your agenda as supervisors and part of your practice, and I think that's great. So next one here's another list. What about this one? Any other aspects? I mean, you know, there might be similar concerns or other additional concerns, or, you know, kind of complementary concerns. Any ideas?
Anybody there? Maybe to add to the conversation that's not in here, besides being dated, some of them are dated textbooks, and textbooks are not always rigorous. They just cover on the surface the conceptual ideas and not giving to the real discussions. Too old, I see that's a comment. Look like a shopping mall conversation. Sibangani, thank you for that. Very broad and general, Rolf, there's a comment. Too diverse.
Yeah. So let me get to the comment about the textbooks. So textbooks can be very useful for literature reviews because they give a student a kind of a quick entry point. But they are not, again, they are not trying to make a scholarly contribution in that sense, right? So you don't want to have students rely on you on things like that. So the bottom two, for example, are kind of in that mold. And then, you know, the second one, that fits more the kind of thing we're looking at. This is a journal that is peer reviewed. It has a certain degree of theoretical ambition. And so this could be useful. There is a point about too old, right? So age by itself is not really a disqualifier for this, but it's often a signal that there could be problems. Why? Because, you know, there's if it is an influential piece, there's likely to be a whole lot of stuff that's been done since then that has taken the conversation further. And that is especially the case when you have these very famous authors like Theodor Adorno, right? I mean, Adorno is one of these very famous, you know, philosophers and sociologists that this is now, you know, 47 years ago or so, 48 years ago, and so much has been done based on this book of his that it's almost a bit like it could almost be a little bit arrogant, right? Because you're almost implying that the you know 2,000 other people that have written about this stuff since 1973 have really missed major aspects. That could be the case, but you want to be careful making that kind of assertion or that kind of implication. But the point I also want to add to this is that they are not really related. They're not in conversation with each other. So, you know, I mean, Buchholz and Rosenthal, maybe they quote Adorno, but I actually don't think so. And the other two probably don't, right? So there's quite little interaction, so to speak, between these pieces. And so that doesn't mean you can't have them in your list of conversants, but it makes it a lot more difficult, right? So it helps if there's some kind of degree of cohesion between the articles that you are putting into your literature review. They want to have some interrelationship, because you remember this analogy of a cocktail party conversation around a table. It's a bit like if you have a list like this, it's a bit like coming to a table where everyone's on their cell phone doing their own thing. Yeah, that's not a very helpful conversation to be part of, because they're not interacting with each other. So you want to make sure that there's some degree of conversation that is going on between these articles that you are putting on the table for yourself. One more aspect here. One more aspect or example. My work's about creating a completely new direction and so on. There are no primary conversants. What is your response to this student? Overly ambitious? Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's overly ambitious, because to know where you're going to, you have to know where you're coming from, and you still have to say, you know, where you're coming from. So it's good to say that, but you still have to acknowledge where you've come from.
Yeah. So head in the clouds. That's an interesting one. Teresa, what do you mean by that?
no basis in reality. You know, this kind of falls into the same category, I think, as let there be light, which is a bit overly ambitious.
Okay, I mean, Mia's also spoke about this slightly overambitious stuff, yeah, and did not really search. That's also an interesting one, right? Let me give you an example though, where this kind of statement might come from. Then, yeah. I mean, Trevor, I must be honest. I did push back on this particular student quite strongly. You know, sometimes I thought I was a little bit unfair, but it was a bit in the line of what you were saying here, Trevor. But there are examples. There are examples where I can kind of see where this kind of thing is coming from, and I'll give you an example. One of my own students, in fact, right? And this was a couple of years ago. She was wanting to do her PhD on artificial intelligence in organizational change. You know, basically, how's the use of AI or machine learning influencing the dynamics between employees in an organization? And so, if you want to look at that specific issue, this is 5 years ago, by the way, right, or 4 years ago. So there was hardly anything in the organizational studies literature on machine learning or AI. Things have changed radically, right? There's like basically almost every issue of AMR or AMJ, there's something about AI these days. So things have really shifted very quickly. But back then, there was not a lot for her to get a handle on. So, okay, an ultra-grounded theory study, but you know, I generally discourage students from taking that kind of purist approach to, or like, I almost call it a fundamentalist approach to grounded theory. You know, that kind of view of grounded theory, I think, is not really very practical or helpful for most students. So I think Mia's has made an interesting point here, right? Consult literature on change. Okay, you could do that. But actually, and this is going in the direction of what we actually ended up doing, which is to say that it's true that in those days there was no literature on AI in organizations. But what is AI a specific instance of? It's a technology. And there is, in fact, a very rich tradition on the ways in which technologies interact with organizational processes. So some of you will know the work of Steve Barley, for example. There's a very famous ASQ, Administrative Science Quarterly article on, what was it? The CAT scan. I think CAT scanners, when those were introduced in the 80s, he did a fantastic study of how that changed the whole dynamics within a particular organizational setting, right? And so since then, there's been a whole lot of work on that issue. And then you see, then it allows you to also specify the gap, because you can see, well, we know A, B, and C because of the technology in organization research. What is different about AI relative to those existing forms of technology? It might, you know, it is iterative, it's self-referential or whatever, right? You don't always know. You don't always know how it gets to an answer, for example. Those are very clear differences where you can then say, that is something we don't know from the existing research on technology, therefore we have a gap in the literature, or we have a problem in the literature. We can then say our research question is going to address exactly that.
Yeah.
Right? So that is one of the things that I think is useful for students to grapple, and where you as a supervisor can help her or him you know, identify a literature that is maybe not immediately obvious, but is definitely relevant to this study. All right, let me move on. I think it's worthwhile to recognize that there's quite a lot of diversity in the journal landscape, right? So one of the ways in which I, you know, think about a PhD is, and a lot of the other questions that have been raised previously as well about, well, how do you know there's enough depth or quality or width in a PhD? I have a pretty basic rule of thumb, which is, will this get published in a reputable journal? Okay, so if that rule of thumb is of any use, I think it's also important, however, to recognize that actually there are quite a wide variety of journals out there, And, you know, they have different audiences and different objectives of different thematic orientations. And, you know, yes, there are varying degrees of, you know, competitiveness, right? Some journals are much more competitive than others. But at the end of the day, you want to get published and have your work come out there beyond a thesis that very few people read. So you have journals like AMJ here, for example, which is a very competitive, empirical and theory-based journal. It's got a very global orientation. In other words, the audience could be anywhere in Singapore or Melbourne or Austin, Texas, right? So energy policy is also a reputable scholarly journal, but they are much more practice-oriented. They, as the name suggests, they are interested in matters of policy. So you don't have such a high bar in terms of theoretical contribution. You want to add to the conversation about how do we actually grapple with renewables, with investment, and all these kinds of quite practical issues. Also global, however. So if you write something about South Africa, then you need to clarify why it's relevant to somebody sitting in India or something. So then on the right of the picture here on the top, here's a journal that is also quite practically oriented, Development Southern Africa, and it has a geographic focus. So in other words, there you have less of a kind of pressure to demonstrate a global relevance, because they are, you know, number one, your audience is interested in development. Number two, your audience is interested in Southern Africa. So, you know, it can be a little bit more kind of specific to a particular context. And so, you know, what I'm getting at, and by the way, the two on the bottom are more practice oriented. They are not really scholarly publications. So if your student is not interested in becoming an academic, that could be a great outcome, right? But if your student wants to get into a good university, especially overseas, then they would have to go to the top row and preferably to the left, especially if they want to go to a business school. I'm impaling myself here on a sharp thing. So the point I'm making is the salient conversation depends on where you want to get published. If a student is very practically oriented, for instance, we have a bunch of students who work in our energy infrastructure unit, and for them, energy policy is like a fantastic journal. I'm not going to say to them, no, you need to be more theory focused, you need to go to AMJ or ASQ or Org Science. It doesn't make sense. I mean, why should they? Because their audience, the people they interact with on a scholarly conversation level, is in energy policy. Okay. Moving on swiftly, because I think we are running out of time. I want to basically wrap up, and then I think we can also open for conversation. I do hope there's going to be some questions and so on. Part of the supervisor's job, and so by the way, if I see there are some comments and questions, I can't, as I go along, I can't always read them. So please,
I'll do that for you. No problem.
You know, and if it isn't exactly specific to a slide, then please also remind me at the end, right? So that we can address some of those things and have a conversation about them. So the point I want to make here is that it's quite a tricky. Sorry, no, I'm actually very busy. No, just later, right? This is what you get when you have teenagers in the house. Close the door, please. Yeah. Yeah. He says hi.
Send our regards.
Yeah, I'll tell you. So quite a lot of scholars and quite a lot of students, you know, they come into a PhD program, they are bright, they're excited, they're creative, they're very innovative. And then it's quite interesting to see that some of them, you know, when we talk about what it takes to, for instance, publish in a demanding journal, they get a little bit overwhelmed, but also sometimes quite frustrated by the significant degrees of convention that are involved in you know, kind of competitive publishing. I mean, for instance, you know, we would talk about a particular journal will expect in the introduction, something like 6 paragraphs. In paragraph 1, you say this, in paragraph 2, you say that, in paragraph 3. And for them, that feels stifling, right? I think for most of these students, 4 or 5 years later, 3 or 4 years later, I think they have come to recognize some of the benefits of the convention, because the boundaries that the conventions give allow actually quite a lot of creativity and innovation. But especially when they come into the first year, they don't see that yet. So they find it quite frustrating. So I think part of a supervisor's job is to help them balance this somewhat challenging need to grapple with convention and scholarship, and at the same time foster still and celebrate the curiosity that actually got them into the PhD in the first place. Here's a quote that I quite like about that sense of curiosity, and this is from a wonderful interview with Eva Salutis, who's a well-known marine biologist, and she writes, "Science is an organized form of wonder." And I think that's a wonderful, excuse the pun, a beautiful way to think about science, including social science, right? Every scientific study comes out of a wondering. You see something happen in the field and ask, what's going on? Why is that happening? And I think this is something that actually really, good supervisors do. So I have a colleague who's also a wonderful author, Robin Nilsson, and I've kind of watched him speak to some of his students, and sometimes they will get quite caught up in the little details of what's going on, what they're thinking about, and he'll just say, well, what's puzzling you here? Or what did you think, what surprised you? Or what was interesting, right? And then that allows the kind of breakthrough where the student can chart a new path that energizes them while at the same time developing a capacity to have a conversation within the conventions of scholarship. So the 7th, I think that's the last point I want to make. The 7th point is that we then need to help link the literature review and the theoretical gap or problem into the rest of the proposal and eventually thesis, right? So as I said, a lot of our students, they start with a practical problem, and then it's one way to help them think about the literature reviews to say, what does the literature tell us about this issue? And identify a salient conversation in the literature, or perhaps 2 conversations, and then you need to identify the intersection, right? That help us understand this issue, whether it's AI in organizations, whether it's corporate responses to community resilience, or whatever it is. So quite often, and I didn't have time to talk about this, but quite often it's the intersection between 2 conversations that give you a particular interesting angle on the issue. In fact, in Anne Huff's book, there's a diagram of these intersecting, it's like a Venn diagram with intersecting sets, and that representing certain conversations in the literature. That can be quite a useful way to also structure your literature review, because then you can say, okay, my first conversation is this, second conversation is that, here's the way that they intersect, and this is what still needs to be figured out, which is the kind of gap or problem in the research. In the proposal, which you then respond to by saying, here's a question that if we answer this question, we can at least make some steps to addressing this gap or problem in the literature. So one of the articles that I also want to recommend on this is Alverson and Sandberg in AMR. And they talk about generating research questions through problematization. And one of the reasons that's interesting is because it actually helps us distinguish between 2 very common ways. Well, let me rephrase that. It actually makes us think about, well, how do we identify the rationale of a study through a literature review? And the most common approach is to identify gaps in existing theories. right? So I'm going to, and then what Alverson and Sandberg do is they say, here's a second approach, which they call problematization. And it's quite, I think it's quite useful to think about those two approaches and to help students think about which of those approaches they want to take. This article also illustrates that the problematization route is a lot more demanding in many cases, right? And so we have quite a few students that come into the program and they want to take on like underpinning assumptions in the field of strategy, for example, right? And we think that is fantastic. They want to approach it from a complexity perspective or a processual, or they come with a, some kind of fancy philosophical framework or something. And we say to them, fantastic, go for it. But recognize that this is a tough route that you are taking, right? And this article is a really useful way to think about this. So I'm not going to read it. I think you can read it in your own time, especially because the slides are going to be shared, the abstract, and I recommend you download the article for a closer look. But here is a figure or table that comes out of that article. So for them, problematization is about generating novel research questions through really criticizing the underlying assumptions in a particular literature. Right, and so there's a spectrum, as it were, between in-house assumptions, which are assumptions within quite a specific group of scholars, and then going in the middle through paradigms, which are some of the ontological, epistemological, and methodological assumptions. And this is one aspect where perhaps my take on paradigms is a bit different to the one that was mentioned a bit earlier by Franzél. Sometimes underlying assumptions are worthy of critique, right? And that is what quite a bit of problematization actually involves. And I think the decolonization movement in the paradigm space is part of this, because it's what that movement is saying is that some of the assumptions in a very Eurocentric or colonial, perhaps even colonial way of doing science need to be explicated, foregrounded, and criticized. And then all the way to field level assumptions. And then you're kind of really going for very grand kind of critiques of almost paradigm shifts of this sort of a relativity upheaval in physics, right, from Newtonian physics, which all of these are really tough because you have to explicate the underlying assumptions. So most students, in fact, and this is why I'm just going to go back to this slide here, I think actually for most students, I say to them, you know what, gap spotting is difficult enough to get into a good journal, rather go that route. So it's just past 5:50. We do want to have at least a few minutes. Hopefully some of you do have some questions, but here is basically a summary of the 7 points that I'm recommending based on my experience to supervisors when and as they try to help their students engage in a lit review. So,
Thank you, Rolf. I think there's 2 specific questions, and I'm going to start with Mohammed's first question. How can a theoretical contribution have a practical impact without implementation, and how do we implement the theories?
Well, I mean, bear in mind, remember, oh, so this thing has gone out. That's actually fine. Let me stop share that we've seen enough slides for the day. So remember that framework that I spoke to, right? I mean, the theoretical gap or problem relates to a practical problem. So for example, my student on AI and organizations, that is a problem that the issues around how do we adapt organizations in the interaction with these new capabilities that AI is offering organizations. That is something that managers are struggling with. That's a very practical thing. And so if my student then says, okay, well, I'm going to approach this from theories that are based on Bali and others that have talked about, materiality of technologies, all some kind of fancy words that, by the way, the practitioners, they don't care about those fancy words. the theoretically informed research study will give rise to an argument that speaks both to the academics, right? But in different language, by the way, it also speaks to the practitioners. So, I mean, one of the things that we try to do with, in our own work and our work with students is if we publish a scholarly article, we are addressing the academics, and they expect a certain kind of language and a certain kind of, again, these conventions around methodology and all of that stuff. The practitioners don't care. So for them, we write a very separate kind of document. So you mentioned the embedding project earlier. We write practitioner guides. They are something like 10 pages long. The sentences are short, paragraphs are short. It's very direct and practical. We know that these managers don't spend more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes looking at some of these things. So we have tried to adapt our writing for a very different kind of reading style. And that also includes things like op-eds that you can publish in something like The Conversation. So just the other day, one of my former PhD students who's now at UJ, he emailed me and said, we've got this paper in Business and Society on multinational corporations responding to Black economic empowerment. Why don't we convert that into an op-ed? And, even though the article's already been published for 2 years or so, 3 years, that was actually quite a useful thing to do, because now it's more in a public domain. A much broader audience looks at that, perhaps policymakers, perhaps managers. They didn't even know that scholarly article existed, right? So there's, to answer your question, I think the interaction between practical and scholarly, or practical and theoretical contribution, is baked into your research design. These are not separate things. And then you address both in your study. And so in your thesis as well, you can have, in your discussion section, you would have your 1, 2, or 3 theoretical contributions. And then you would also have a subsection or something like, or some paragraphs at least, where you say, here are some of the practical implications, where you address the needs faced by managers and how your study can help address them. And then, as I say, you can also have different kinds of outputs from your research.
Yeah, thank you, Rolf. I think that in many ways also answer the question that Patrick asked later on. There's an interesting question from Philemon here, and say we are often cautioned when publishing in predatory journals. So what do we do? What's the implications if students are using those journals as sources? Which is realistic, because it do happen.
So I was actually looking for that comment in the chat.
That one is 5:46 p.m., 40 minutes to 6, Philemon Sitole.
Thanks, Philemon. We're often cautioned about publishing in predatory journals. Okay, yeah, so yes. I would avoid it. I mean, just the same way that we are cautioned to publish in those journals. I mean, we would generally avoid citing them. Although, I mean, to be honest, it doesn't really come up in my students. I mean, we basically, I think we socialize. We need to try to socialize our students to recognize quality in the articles and in the journals. And so they, we try to support them in figuring out where they want to get published, right? So if you want to get published in a certain kind of journal, then you need to read those journals, and you need to prioritize those journals in your lit review. And for various reasons, you probably don't want to publish in some of these problematic journals. And so therefore, why would you want to use that stuff in your lit review, right? I mean, that is a kind of a general comment. There might well be exceptions. I mean, who knows? There might be a fantastic article in some of these journals that are considered.
Yeah.
So I want to be cautious about being too, kind of totalitarian about any of this.
Yeah.
But
no, I think that's it. Yeah. Mia's also said we must take a strong position, and that's exactly correct. Teresa, thank you for answering or expanding on Patrick's question after Rolf. Salome, you've got a question. I saw your hand raised, so you want to ask something.
It's more of it's a contribution, and maybe just to think something to think of. I was a practitioner for many, many moons before I decided to do a doctorate. And then it was because of the passion of the field. So as a practitioner, I felt comfortable with the deep prof because there were constantly deliverables involving audiences, and the knowledge could spread faster rather than it being read by a few people and not being implementable. And I was just wondering why South Africa has not really embraced this kind of study, because there is really a need for immediacy in the transferring of learning to, from us as academics and our students to the real world. So I'm just curious about that.
So what do we mean by that kind of study? What are you referring to?
The kind of improv or deep prof. I don't see much of it offered in South Africa, and I find it to be a very appropriate in terms of making theory very practical soon, and giving it legs, giving the study some legs, and implementing it, helping people to implement it sooner rather than later, if it makes sense. And I'm just wondering why in a country that needs transfer of knowledge so much, why have we not embraced that kind of study, that kind of degree?
Yeah, I mean, I must be honest. I'm not sure. I know what study you're referring to or what these labels refer to.
It's called a deep prof. So you do a professional degree, and you deliverables while you're studying, while you're doing your dissertation, is also workshops and training programs that you have to design and deliver in your field.
Okay, so you're talking about also like a DBA, kind of this conversation with Mias was going in that
Similar,
direction.
yeah. I guess.
So at UCT, for instance, there is a very rigorous conversation around professional degrees, and of course, in some areas like arts and so on, or there's a long conversation around what constitutes this kind of contribution. We really have an uphill there, and I can understand some of the resistance, because if you are saying that a PhD is a contribution to knowledge, a theoretical knowledge, then it's almost antithetical to say here's some other kind of doctorate that is about practical knowledge, because then it's basically like an MBA plus. And so there is a tension there, right? I do understand there's some resistance to this. At the same time, I think your points are very well taken. So we do, because like in our program, we do say that we want you as a student to make a theoretical and a practical contribution. So there's also a book and an article that we work with quite a lot. It's called, the book is called Engaged Scholarship, and the article has got a similar name. The article is an Academy of Management review 2006 by Andy van der Ven and Johnson. And that provides a kind of both a rationale, a justification, but also quite practical ideas for what they call a knowledge co-creative process. And that is, I think quite a lot of our research actually takes that kind of approach. Where, for instance, in the embedding project, we have these workshops with managers, and we have these conversations. We ask managers, what is it that you're grappling with? What questions are on your mind, right? What are you challenged with? And then we take those issues into our research, and we sometimes, quite often, in fact, we say to the practitioners, we say, we want to do research with this. Will you join this research project? And we have this continuous conversation, not just the beginning and at the end of the research project, but throughout the whole project. Where there's a more of a co-creative aspect of knowledge creation rather than a translation act. I think there's also a growing around exactly that topic.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you, Salome. That's excellent. I'm just mindful of the time because we need to respect it's a lot of people, their days are not finished yet. So if I can close it here and say, Rolf, thank you very much. We really appreciate an informative session. And I think, looking at the articles on that left of your diagram, as you referred to, that's where we should focus on when we're in this discussion, what's in the article and which ones are valuable. And that point is well taken. And also the response to the questions, if there's more questions by the delegates, you're more than welcome to post them in the chat. We will definitely get back to them tomorrow in the last session, starting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. But I enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed that. Please feel free to log off, and as you say goodbye, you can switch on your screen and just wave to the audience. And then may you have a good and a blessed evening. And to the presenters this afternoon, Franzél, Mias, and Rolf, thank you very much on behalf of SABSA, from Anne and Jonas and myself. It was a very interesting discussion. Everybody that participated, it made it worth the while. Thank you very much, colleagues. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Noel.
Thanks, and enjoy that.
Thank you very much for the presentations.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Enjoy the evening. Take care.